Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Baylin Duryea, an assistant professor of law, to talk about the history of American involvement in the crafting of Afghanistan's 2004 constitution and the lessons that we can learn from its successes and failures in the wake of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Catherine, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So you're obviously talking about a topic in your research that's very topical now. It's been on the minds of a lot of Americans. Can you just start by giving us a brief overview of what it is that you're studying and what is the main argument of your research?
Sure. So I've been looking at the drafting process of the Afghan Constitution of 2004. And in doing so, I've also done a bit of research into Afghanistan's constitutional history, which spans most of the 20th century. But I was particularly interested in understanding the American role in drafting that particular constitution because of the kind of the pageantry surrounding it. I don't know if your listeners remember, but the 2004 Constitution was adopted at a big tent where there were hundreds of Afghan delegates in this really stunning visual that drew parallels to other sort of constitutional founding moments. And I found that those images and that moment really stunning in terms of what it said about American ideas about constitutionalism, and I wanted to understand the legacy of that foreign involvement in the Afghan constitutional process. And so I did that. I'm a legal historian, and I did that through like one very particular lens. So I did kind of the deep dive into the history of, or the evolution of judicial review and constitutional interpretation in Afghanistan since 2004. And a lot obviously has changed pretty rapidly in Afghanistan in the past couple of weeks, couple of months. And so now I think people are interested in understanding why the US-backed Afghan government fell so quickly. And I think that there's a lot to say there that had to do with military failures and other areas, but I think that part of the story is legal and it gets to some of the failings of the 2004 Constitution and the political developments that came after it. So that's what I've been researching.
Can you talk a little bit about what did this Constitution look like in terms of how it was structured, how powers were allocated? Was this a constitution that gave a lot of strong powers to the central government, or was the power dispersed? How much power was vested in the military? Like, if you can just touch on some of those topics to give people a sense of what this constitution looked like, and maybe you can even go into aspects that I didn't just mention.
Sure. So I think you hit on what was one of the most controversial aspects of the Constitution, which was how much power to concentrate in the hands of the central government and what that central government would look like. So particularly whether it would be a presidential or a parliamentary system. Now, earlier in the drafting process in 2003, there were actually earlier drafts that did create a parliamentary system, which would have just sort of by its nature had a more diffuse power system, right? Because you would have had delegates from all over the country representing their parties, and then whichever party got a majority or was able to build a coalition would have been able to put up a prime minister. And so you have perhaps a less powerful prime minister, but a more diffuse power base. And that system was eventually rejected in favor of a more American-style presidency, and which concentrates more power in the hands of one person, more power in the hands of sort of one person who can be more easily perhaps influenced or dominated by a foreign power. And in doing so, that was paired with a government structure that put a lot of power in the hands of the central government, and didn't have there wasn't a strong federal system, right? So we had the kind of more American style president, but not really American style federalism with really strong states that would have kept a lot of power in the local governments. So you had a strong president paired with a strong central government, which led to the concentration of a lot of power, at least formally, a lot of formal power in Kabul and in the hands of the president. And that government structure had the support of the US, because they presumed that Hamid Karzai, who was their ally, would be the first president accurately. And they favored a structural arrangement where they thought it would be easy easy to work with him. And so that prevailed in the end over a more dispersed power arrangements or a parliamentary system.
How difficult was it to transport these ideas of constitutionalism outside of the capital into areas where the reception might not have been as positive toward this new Western style of governance?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So a couple of things. So I do want to mention that Afghanistan does have a century of constitutional history. Its first constitution that we would think of, its first modern constitution, was from 1923. So it's not entirely a foreign concept, right? This idea of constitutional government. But I think what you hit at, a key challenge that the Constitution drafters faced, though, which was this divide between the urban parts of Afghanistan and the rural parts of Afghanistan. And that I would say, a massive but not incredibly successful effort to involve a lot more people than just kind of the stakeholders in Kabul in the drafting process itself. There were radio campaigns, there were print campaigns, there were public education campaigns, there were meetings all over the country. So we should back up a little bit and say that the UN and allies set up the secretariat that kind of ran the process of the Constitution drafting. And so through the secretariat, they were able to hold all these public consultations. They solicited public comments, and when they got tens of thousands of them. So in one sense, that was very successful, right? And you can see a lot of effort and a lot of sort of real conviction went into that, right? That they wanted to both educate the public on this constitution and also solicit feedback. But when you kind of look past that, you see that the effort ended up being not a great success. So there was some polling. So you can imagine polling is a little bit difficult to do in Afghanistan or anywhere really. But there was some polling at the time that showed somewhere between 0 and 75% of different populations. So in different areas of the country, between men and women, urban and rural, were even aware of the constitutional process. So that was, the 0 was among women in a particular rural province who just hadn't even heard about what was happening, up to about 75% of people in more urban areas who had even heard of the constitutional process. But that means there's still 25% of people who haven't even heard of it, let alone have any information about what's actually happening, right? I mean, just having heard of it is a pretty low bar. And then even among people who were informed about what was going on and were able to contribute to that process. So I mentioned the Secretariat collected tens of thousands of these feedback questionnaires. They got suggestions. There were reports back from community meetings. And they wrote it all up into this great report that kind of summarized, not perfect, but probably the best estimate of public opinion about what kind of constitutional government the Afghan public actually wanted. And that report ended up having very little impact. So it was distributed to the members of that large meeting that I mentioned, the Constitutional Loya Jirga, but only once they arrived. And so at that point, it was fairly late in the process. There was already an existing constitutional draft. And so it didn't have the kind of impact that one would have hoped public opinion might have been able to have, particularly on some of those real controversial issues, some of which I've already mentioned about the fundamental structure of government. The particular issue that I was very interested in, this question of constitutional interpretation and judicial review, there was a lot of public support for some type of constitutional court. So some kind of judicial body that was tasked with interpreting and enforcing the Constitution. And that's not quite what ended up happening. Afghanistan ended up with a Supreme Court and then a sort of rival body that both claimed the authority to interpret the Constitution. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but it's just one example of where there were a range of public opinions for sure, but they did coalesce around some kind of dedicated constitutional court. And then that decision was disregarded, and that happened several times. So I think you've hit on a key challenge when it came to drafting this Constitution, which is that American style Constitution drafting relies on at least the pretext that the Constitution represents the will of the people, right? That's really inherent in American notions of sovereignty and was a driving force behind a lot of the decisions that motivated both the procedure and the substance of this Constitution for Afghanistan. And yet that pretext is really hard to substantiate once you look at even our limited knowledge about public opinion and public preferences.
And what you just said leads into the next question pretty well, which is how involved were Afghans in the actual drafting of a constitution? Or was this effectively just a body of Americans together in a room writing it?
Okay, so it was definitely not the latter. If you look into the history of American imposed constitutions, you can definitely find examples. I'm thinking primarily of Japan, where it was a much more American-led process. This was different. This was more of a hybrid situation. I would say this was pretty, I think, reflective of what we might think of as a contemporary or 21st century imposed constitution, which is to say that there was significant Afghan involvement, for sure, at every step of the process. But when you look at the people who were selected to be involved, right, it was people who were brought in because they were allies of the Americans. So the very beginning of the drafting process actually happened at a meeting in Germany, in Bonn, where they kind of laid out some general principles about how the transitional government would work. And that meeting, there were essentially representatives of like 4 different groups of Afghans. And so it was a meeting of Afghans, but one that had been convened by Americans and the UN and their allies. And I think that set the tone for the rest of the process. So I think the process was really driven by a sense that foreigners could control the procedure and the process, but that it's no longer acceptable, right? It was no longer acceptable in the 2000s for foreigners to just come in and write the Constitution. So that's not what the Americans were doing, but they were controlling the timeline, the funding, well, the Americans and the UN, controlling the timeline, the funding, right? Who was put in positions of power, and essentially guiding the process every step of the way. And it's, I think, a misunderstanding that you can really separate process and procedure that you can separate process and procedure from substance. So to give just one kind of example, imagine a very short timeline where there's only going to be a couple of months or maybe a year to draft the entire constitutional process. That's a procedural question, sure, but it significantly favors groups that are already organized, and it disfavors grassroots groups or groups that have been that are less organized and traditionally been marginalized, because they're just not going to have time to really mobilize and organize themselves into a way where they can meaningfully participate. So that's just one example that's kind of easy to get of a procedural decision that impacts substance. And there were dozens, hundreds of these decisions every step of the way that were really being driven by the outsiders. So that's one answer to the question. And then the other side of it is that there were American red lines on certain issues. So for instance, gender equality. There were the ambassador at the time, Zalmay Khalilzad, who's still active in negotiating the deals related to Afghanistan today. He's been pretty open about the fact that there were certain American red lines that typically had to do with things like individual rights and women that they were simply just not going to accept. But more commonly, the US and the UN didn't necessarily take a really firm line on exactly what the content had to be, but they had general preferences that shaped the direction of the document. So for instance, preference for a strong executive with few institutional or legal checks on presidential authority. So that doesn't mean that they were in there writing the article on presidential authority necessarily, but it does mean that all of those drafts where they preferred a parliamentary system with a more decentralized network of power distribution, that those got disregarded and replaced with one that had a highly centralized government with a strong president. So I think, I don't think it's possible to really classify it as an American or an Afghan document. It's both. And different provisions had different histories, and it was really a joint effort. Makes it sound really collaborative and good, but there were clearly Afghans who had a lot of influence, but the parameters were really set by the foreigners.
You had just mentioned in one of your previous answers about Afghans looking for certain qualities in a constitutional judicial body and then it not turning into that in the end. Can you go a little more into that story and break it down for people who don't quite know what you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. So this is the piece of the Constitution that I was really interested in and focused in on. So the way I came to this question was actually about 10 years ago when I first learned about the fact that Afghanistan had two institutions, both of which claimed the authority to interpret the Constitution. And I was just fascinated by that. Like, how did that happen? Because judicial review is one of the hallmarks of modern constitutionalism. I mean, propelled forward by, again, this American sense that of judicial supremacy, and that there should be a Supreme Court or a constitutional court or something, some kind of body that has the supreme final authority to interpret the Constitution. But of course, it's not just the US. In South Africa, which I think is perhaps the most well-known and very successful modern constitution drafting exercise, there's a very strong, clear constitutional court with a clear mandate of constitutional interpretation. And so, regardless of whether you think that a constitutional court is necessary or the correct way to go, it's certainly a really powerful model. And so it was just bizarre that you'd have this constitution written in 2004 or adopted in 2004 that wasn't clear about judicial review. It was just a puzzle that I wanted to understand. And so it turns out that during the drafting process, as I alluded to, this ended up being a really controversial issue. And so in earlier drafts, there was a strong, clear constitutional court. And without getting too much into the weeds of the drafting process, essentially what happened is there were a bunch of different commissions that produced different drafts. And then the draft was given to Hamid Karzai and his advisors. And the expectation was that he was just going to make it public, right? That it was sort of a pass through. But instead, he edited it pretty significantly. And one of the things that he changed significantly was this constitutional court, and essentially got rid of it and gave the powers to the Supreme Court. Now, that might seem like not a big deal, but the Supreme Court of Afghanistan, so it already existed, was already staffed by judges. And so he knew who those judges were. And it was generally sort of perceived that they would be more friendly to a strong executive and less of an outside institutional check on executive power. So in combination with a bunch of other changes that were made to the Constitution at the same time, this was seen very much as a way to streamline presidential power and remove external or independent checks on presidential power. So then when that was the draft that was released to the public, and was debated at the Constitutional Loya Jirga, this big meeting in the big tent that I referenced earlier. And so when the delegates gathered at the Jirga, this was a controversial issue because many of them wanted some kind of additional external institution that would be able to interpret the Constitution, maybe strike down laws. Now, there were different understandings of what that institution would be like. And you can see that because there were different coalitions of people supporting that institution at different times. So at first, you had the liberals and the women supporting the institution. And I think you can imagine they were picturing that it would be one kind of secular institution. At another time, you had more religious mujahideen supporting it. And there's speculation that they were thinking more of like a religious court, something more like the Council of Guardians in Iran that might actually review laws for compliance with Islamic law. And so you had these shifting coalitions of support. So there wasn't necessarily agreement about what this institution should look like or what exactly its role should be, but there was a lot of opposition to having all of these powers vested solely in the Supreme Court, which was seen as being very aligned with executive and presidential authority. So we get to this meeting, there's a lot of controversy, there's debate, like some very dramatic, with people like walking out of the meeting. And there was some speculation about whether this was actually going to result in a successfully promulgated constitution. And here's where the foreigners enter into the story again, right? They essentially mandated that an agreement had to happen and that it had to happen quickly. So the UN was funding the meeting, and there were foreign advisors sitting off on a side tent that didn't really make it onto the cameras, who were actually calling a lot of the shots about what happened and what compromises were made. So a lot of the real debating and compromises actually happened kind of on these side tents, not really in the main area where like regular delegates could participate in the decision making. And so one of these kind of backdoor agreements that was eventually reached was that they would create this commission. It was an independent commission to oversee the implementation of the Constitution, and it had some ill-defined powers alongside the Supreme Court, which had some ill-defined powers. And there wasn't a real agreement about what those institutions looked like, but they managed to put some text down and then pass the Constitution by a voice vote. So there was never really a chance to kind of revise those provisions or flesh out exactly what they meant. It was just an up-down vote on the last day, essentially approving it as part of like a big compromise package. So that's how we ended up with these competing institutions.
And I just have a couple more questions before we wrap up. You had mentioned it very briefly in one of your answers, talking about how, the U.S. has been involved in constitution building before, notably Japan, and, that didn't result in the same political catastrophe as it did in Afghanistan. I guess you've touched on a lot of the reasons why there were so many problems in the political construction of Afghanistan in the 2000s, but are there any other reasons that maybe you didn't mention that have to do with the legal side of things? And then as a second part to that, I wanted to see if you could give us some insight into, what are the biggest lessons that we can learn from the failures of constitution crafting in Afghanistan, and just maybe other political lessons that we can learn from everything that's happened in the past couple of months?
Sure. Okay, those are some big questions. I'll try to be brief. To the first point, so I should mention the extent of American involvement in the drafting of the Japanese Constitution was a secret. And when it came out later, it was a huge scandal in Japan. But nevertheless, that didn't result in overturning or amending the Constitution, which was working. And so I think American officials very much saw Japan and Germany as success stories and were emboldened by that when they went into Afghanistan and Iraq, and that they were I think George Bush even referred to the post-World War II imposed constitutions as beacons, right? And so that they were these guiding models of what could happen. And there were a lot of parallels between specifically what happened in Germany and then the American approach in Afghanistan. But I think having now seen the complete collapse of Afghan constitutional governance, look, as I said before, there's a lot of reasons why. Massive corruption, military failures in terms of training and getting the Afghan military to stand on its own, the widespread civilian, not even just casualties, but I think Americans don't fully appreciate how awful life was for many Afghans under American occupation, particularly outside of Kabul. So, there's a lot. I'm not trying to argue that like the Kabul fell to the Taliban because of confusion over judicial review, right? That's not the only, but part the story is really at least two parts, right? I mean, one is the Taliban's military and other successes, but the other is the complete and immediate collapse of the coalition-supported Afghan government. And I think there is where you can learn something from, and we could learn something from the 2004 Constitution and the other failures of state building, which is that the Constitution did not lead to a functional government, right? Well, part of the reason that the Taliban could conquer areas, I don't want to say so easily, because I think there's this misnomer that like no one really fought back when actually there's been fighting going on for months, but nevertheless, right, that they could do so quickly and successfully. I think one of the reasons is that in 20 years, the central government never demonstrated that it could actually govern effectively and efficiently. And that is because of a myriad different, disputes and incompetencies and corruptions and all kinds of things. But one piece of that is that the legal system couldn't reliably and efficiently resolve disputes of governance because of this conflict over judicial review. Because how it ended up playing out was that you had these different institutions competing with each other, and different government actors could go from one to the other to try to get an interpretation of the Constitution that favored them. And in the end, I think it's just a microcosm of some of the greater problems that were facing the Afghan government, where they were simply unable, and I think the Americans did not always prioritize trying to build efficient, effective systems that actually worked for Afghans, to resolve disputes for Afghans, rather than working for the foreigners. And that government, those failures of governance are part of what made its collapse so quick and seemingly so sudden.
And just before we finish up, if anyone is listening to this podcast episode and they have an interest in knowing more about the crafting of constitution in Afghanistan, or just Afghan politics, or anything about this general topic, what would be one or two books that you would recommend?
Well, I don't think he's published a book yet, but I highly recommend the work of Shamsed Pasarleh, who wrote a wonderful PhD dissertation on the drafting process, I think, and has published a couple of articles and blog posts about it. Hopefully he will publish the dissertation as a book, but in the meantime, I would recommend his scholarship. I think it's excellent.
Great. Catherine, thank you for being on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
And for those who are interested in viewing more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.